I like short-haired dogs.
Yeah.
So I do like a pit bull. I like maybe it's my urban stuff. I do like those dogs.
Yep.
I think, but I do think they're when they're healthy and in good shape and well taken care of, they're great dogs.
Oh yeah, definitely.
I do like shepherds. I'm a fan of those little British bulldogs.
Mm-hmm.
The little black and white ones.
Yeah.
I'm a big fan.
I saw a thing the other day, a little reel or something. They're now breeding teacup huskies. So think of a husky.
Yeah. Oh, I love
that. Gets
beautiful.
No bigger than 6 to 8 pounds.
Good grief.
They're just little itty bitty things.
I know. You can wear them on a keychain.
Yep. Well, what were those games that we played as a kid? The ones where you
like the Gigapets or something.
Yeah. So
Tamagotchi.
There you go, Tamagotchi.
Yeah, Tamagotchi.
So anyway, should we?
Yeah, let's get started.
Let's get started.
We're losing all this material.
Yeah. So, wait. We almost forgot to introduce ourselves. So, hello and welcome to this episode of Monkey Bread Theology. We are the podcast that answers listeners' questions about theology. So that could be Bible, church, God, Jesus, whatever the case may be. Feel free to run over to monkeybreadtheology.com and submit a question. My name's Tim. I'm the the asker of the question. So I will read off your questions, and sitting across from me, we have Joe Vaughn, who will be the one doing most of the answering. So welcome, and let's continue on. At the time of this recording, we are getting very close to the holidays. So we thought we would cover, you ready for this, Joe Vaughn?
Ready.
Christians and Christmas.
Oh, yeah.
We always hear that this is the season.
The reason for the season.
The reason for the season. And Christ's name and a lot of things.
Right.
So is that biblically based or?
Yeah. So that'll be a fun maze to go through. Hopefully we go in and come out.
Okay. If not, call my mom.
Yeah.
Tell her what happened.
That's right. So let's just start with some basics. One, the word Christmas is not in the Bible.
Okay.
The idea behind Christmas, the word itself, is an English way of describing a feast or service,
okay,
to celebrate the coming of Christ.
Huh.
So it's a Christ Mass.
Okay.
Right. And that's just more of an English way of saying it. And so obviously, when I say Christ Mass, we think probably like a Catholic Church service.
Right.
We think maybe something along the lines of sort of these kind of high church services where there's a lot of rituals and those sorts of things in the pageantry. Well, I grew up, just for full disclosure, I grew up Roman Catholic. So
Mm-hmm.
I have been at so many midnight masses.
Mm-hmm.
I've been at so many Christmas pageants, and so I have a very, very complex relationship to Christmas because
Okay.
So it's complicated.
Yeah.
It's definitely you, not me. No. But the thing is, Christmas is one way of describing what was an ancient church practice, and at least in the West, of this kind of feast of the nativity.
Okay.
So let's back up a little bit. So you have the biblical period of the church, which is the first century. It is the period in which we have obviously the coming of Christ, the death of Christ, the resurrection of Christ, the ascension and the glorification of Christ, and the early church moving in the authority. Excuse me, the authority of this ascended Christ. Well, we have the book of Acts that tells us how the early church moved, a lot of the pacing going on, how it moved from Jerusalem to its region, its province of Judea, and then the next province over, Samaria, and then to the ends of the earth, right? Well, nowhere do you find Christians settling down for festivals. Like the book of Acts is really what it sounds like. It's a book of action. In fact, in Greek, it's the praxis. Today we use that word praxis for things that you do. What is the
practice? Right.
Yeah. What is the practice? It's literally even our English word, practice. Right. So the thing is, the early Christians were all about sharing the gospel of the resurrected, ascended, and glorified Jesus. And the gospel centers on that, especially as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, beginning in verse 1, the gospel I preached to you, if you believed it, that you're saved, that Christ died according to the scriptures, and that he was buried and rose on the third day according to the scriptures, and he appeared, and he begins to list all of his appearances. Well, what I'm getting at here is, the message of Christianity has been dominantly about the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus. However, you can't have the death, burial, resurrection of Jesus without him being born.
Right.
So as Christians, we celebrate the whole spectrum of our Lord's existence. Even do you want to push it even further? According to the Gospel of John verses 1 through 3, we extol Jesus, we celebrate Jesus because he is the eternal God. So if you want to push it back that far, we worship Jesus for his eternalness. He's God in flesh. We celebrate him for coming in the flesh, being a child. We also celebrate Jesus because he died for us. And then we celebrate Jesus because he rose for us. And then we celebrate Jesus because he ascended and is over us. So at every level of Jesus, we celebrate Jesus.
Right.
Okay. So the thing that sometimes happens during Christmas is this focused attention to the birth of Jesus, which, biblically speaking, angels praise the coming of Jesus. Shepherds welcome. We sing the song, shepherds adored him. And then the wise men came and gave him gifts, gave him and Mary and Joseph gifts as a demonstration of their worship and tribute. So Jesus gets a king's tribute before he even walks.
Right.
So the whole image here of Christmas is about that nativity. So it's a really interesting historical move that somewhere around the second and probably more in the third century, there was a festival, mostly in Egypt, and it was somewhat initiated by some Gnostics, as far as I can tell. I might be wrong on that, but basically in Egypt, there was a festival of the Epiphany. Now, growing up Catholic, I heard words like that all the time. Epiphany just means the appearance.
Okay.
All right. That's all that word means. It's the appearing of something or someone. In this particular case, it is the appearance of Jesus. So, this movement of celebrating the appearance of Jesus begins to kind of happen, and mostly we begin to see that happening around January 6th of the year.
Okay.
Now, let me. The reason why I'm getting to this is because there were other Egyptian Christians, and even pushing toward the east, that kind of took this celebration of the appearance of Jesus, which was the moment of his baptism. So these associated the coming or the appearance of Jesus with his baptism, because the Holy Spirit arrives, and in a Gnostic theology, that's a big deal,
Right.
because they emphasize the coming of the Spirit, that Jesus and the Christ are two different things. I don't want to get into that right now, but in essence, they celebrate that on January 6th, the Epiphany of Jesus, when he gets baptized. Well, other Christians in the area also then would celebrate the Epiphany, but because they were not Gnostics, and didn't have the same hangups on the flesh and the spirit, the sort of verse, it was like this verse mode between their body, because it's evil, and the spirit, which is good. And so the Christ who came in the spirit was not Jesus who's in the flesh. It's this.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yes, exactly. And if you need to rewind that, please do so. But these other Christians who didn't have this hang up, they celebrated the Epiphany, but they celebrated not the baptism of Jesus on January 6th, but his birth.
Okay.
Because that's when he really appears.
Right.
That is when he really manifests to creation. So this sort of thing that's happening is really, really interesting, because it happens outside of the New Testament period. It happens outside of the first century. It's sort of happening in the second and late second, early third centuries, and really kind of hitting a what do you call it? They're really hitting its stride by the fourth. So most of this happens in the 300s. Most of this happens in the late 200s.
Okay.
And what's happening is this sort of collision with early Christians sort of finding their feet. And I think this is kind of how we talked about during Halloween, that Christians would take events or they would sort of Christianize things in their culture.
Right.
So if they practiced something like the Day of the Dead, where they honored the dead, right? Instead of attributing the dead in some sort of pagan, garb, they would redress it as, no, we celebrate fallen Christians who have died for their faith or died as Christians, and we long and we look forward their victory over death, and right. So all these cultures that had these sort of intuitions about honoring the legacy of the dead, now Christians are using that as an opportunity to celebrate Jesus' victory over death, and that we'll see them again and we'll celebrate them again, once again. Well, the same is true in other aspects of, as Christians moved throughout history. They would go into different cultures and they would confront these other ideologies. Now, this is a really important point, because as Christians, we are told to take captivity every thought and imagination that's contrary to Christ. Well, how do you do that? You can say we do that by preaching the gospel, which is true and right and proper, and the primary way we do that. But also it can be done through appropriation. And that's one way in which early Christianity handled this, taking every thought captive. This is my view of how this happens, okay? This is the Jovan take on early Christianity, is that they often would take things that were sort of these micro battles. This idea of celebrating the appearance of Jesus, right? And the Gnostics are going to celebrate his baptism because they they have hang-ups about him in the flesh. The dominant point of view of Christians are going to celebrate, well, when did he come?
Mhm.
He came when he was a baby. So you already have this sort of conversation that we honor the fact that God sent Jesus and he appeared and he came as a baby, right?
Mhm.
Well, this then begins to spark conversations about when did he come and how do you address that? Now, the fact of the matter is, you can look up church historians like Everett Ferguson. He has a book on church history, several books actually. But one of the things that he points out is early Christians knew from the first through the third century, we don't know when Jesus was born. Okay. So it was never a matter of trying to they determined it. They tried to figure it out. They stamped their, kind of Marvin the Martian flag on what date that Jesus was born.
Right.
But the thing is, they overall, even with all their attempts to figure some things out, they knew they didn't know.
And we still don't.
And we still don't know. There's no authoritative date for the birth of Jesus. We know a generic timetable. He was born before Herod the Great died. Herod the Great died in BC 4. So year 4 in BC, which is always the funny thing. Jesus was born before Christ, right?
Yeah.
And all that has to do with some dates, confusion of approximately 3 to 4 years, put together by, I think his name was Dennis. I want to call him the Menace. But, yeah, but he's Dennis the Little. He has another fancy word I can't remember, fancy name I can't remember right now, but he helped pretty much our calendar put together. He put it together, and he was off by a couple dates. So Jesus's birth then gets shifted to when Herod dies, which is 4 BC. But Jesus was born probably, if we take Luke's chronology and Matthew's chronology right, 3 or so years before that. So if Herod dies in 4, Jesus was born in 7.
Okay.
Right. So that's a really interesting number, just because, date wise, right? We don't tend to think Jesus would be born for his birthday. Like I wasn't born before my birthday.
No.
Right.
Yeah.
But Jesus apparently is.
Well, against that.
Yeah. So, but back to the dating of Jesus, we only know approximate, right? That's the point. We only know that he was born around 7 or so BC. And as a result of that, or other than that, we have nothing firmer.
Yeah.
I love when people try to say, well, the shepherds were out in the field and therefore this is the season in which shepherds go out in the field. That's all good and fine. But at the end of the day, what day was it?
Yeah.
You can give me a period of the year, but you're not going to be able to tell me the day.
Yeah. I think the last one I heard was like June.
Yeah. So we have to be pretty much we have to be able to accept that ambiguity. We just don't know.
Right.
Well, early Christians understood that for the most part. They did their debates, they had their conversations, but they pretty much knew. Now, the thing that really ends up shifting to our December 25th is this engagement with pagan, the pagan world. So, the word pagan, it means like the farmer, the farmland. Okay. So this is talking about like old country religion, right? And so the pagan or the heathen, which comes from the word for the hearth of the inner home. So these two words that are associated with non Jewish or Christian settings, right, have become these terms for us. Well, basically, the Bible has a word for that. They're Gentiles. Okay, so when Christianity emerges and begins to spread and try to deal with paganism and these sort of micro battles, one of them is, it seems like, based on the evidence I have, The earliest testimony regarding, Christmas and the dating, it comes from these Christian calendars, and they write about how in the 4th century, early middle 4th century, so mid, like say 320s, 330s, Rome, the city, the church there had not been able to really kind of undo the influence of the sun god. Being what's the name? Now I can't think of it. But they would celebrate Invictus, Sol Invictus. They would the victory of the sun, and they would worship the birth of that god on December 25th, what we would call December 25th.
Mm-hmm.
So what Christians in Rome, not necessarily the Roman Catholic Church, but Christians in Rome seem to have been doing is, we're going to Christianize that, we're going to spiritualize that, and that's how we're going to win this war against paganism.
Mm-hmm.
So, and so that is pretty much the tradition, the lore of how Christians went from the gospel is of the resurrected Jesus Christ to Jesus is the reason for the season, because they were having these cultural battles, and they spiritualized pagan activities and gave it a Christian emphasis, a Christian meaning. And because no one knew when Jesus was born, the date specific, it was sort of just, well, this is a great opportunity for us to emphasize not the birth of a god, but the birth of the God. Not that God originated when Mary gave birth, but that Mary gave birth to God in flesh, and he appears. So this is now the Epiphany. This is now the true Epiphany. And so so this thing that we've already been practicing, the Epiphany, is now going to be where we stand against the sun god of the Romans, right? This is the Roman sun god, not the Egyptian sun god.
Okay.
So this becomes a spiritual battle. Now, generations later, Christians have been celebrating the Feast of the Nativity, or what we call Christmas.
Okay.
So the Feast of the Nativity was designed to counter the Feast of the Sun God birth, right? And so over the years, Christians have won the day, so to speak, in history, and Christmas has been this Feast of the Nativity. The thing is, it was never what we celebrate today. It didn't look like what we do today.
Oh yeah.
So it very different. It was there's very little information. The information that I gather is that the things that we do, they would never have been doing. So a feast would have been a feast or a mass of some kind would have been a service.
Okay.
A meal together to celebrate God coming in flesh. So a very biblical idea, the incarnation, John 1:1-18, very biblical. Philippians chapter 2, verses 5 through 12, that God had concern for us, that he did not hold on to being in the form of God. So he emptied himself, then being found in the form of a servant, in the form of a man, he died. And because of that, God elevates him, and so we glorify him. But the whole point there is God became flesh. He was found in the form of a human, the form of a servant. So the issue then that we need just taking this historical approach and this long walkthrough is, in short, the post-biblical period in which Christians are living their lives with, the New Testament hadn't been fully collected yet. It's been, everyone has pieces of it everywhere. Early Christians were sort of living in the oral culture that we're in. They were living by the rule of faith. This is what's been preached. This is what we believe. And encountering then the pagan world, they found opportunities to kind of hijack what everyone was doing and make it theirs.
Right.
And so sometimes we look at that and we see that and describe it as, well, doing that is a decline in pure Christianity. That they are innovating and creating things that are not biblical.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that might be true, that they are innovating, that it is not truly biblical,
Right.
but it's not unbiblical. In other words, the birth of Jesus is not an unbiblical idea.
Right.
But a feast dedicated to it? Okay, sure. Well, this is, we can't change how this came about.
Mm-hmm.
We are sitting on the other end of the telescope. And so we at least should appreciate that the origin of Christmas, or the Feast of the Nativity, was about this battle against paganism.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Now, with that in mind, what about some of these practices? So the practices what are the practices of Christmas, right? That right now?
The Christmas tree, the
Christmas tree,
garlands,
yeah.
Presents, obviously.
Right? The
food.
Yeah, to get them together. So
Santa Claus.
Yeah, Santa Claus. Yeah, right. So,
which actually I think that could probably be another thing.
Well, Santa Claus or Saint Nicholas,
Mm-hmm.
Is likely a historical figure.
I just saw where they were able to get a telescope down into the tomb of St. Nicholas, and some of the bones are still there.
Yeah.
Which they found amazing, because I guess it's been a lot of water. Anyway.
Yeah, really interesting.
Yeah.
Well,
that's not.
That's
the point.
So, but there's an interesting way in which that independent storyline gets merged into Christianity. So the customs really emerged in a hodgepodge, organic way. It's not just like, hey, Feast of the Nativity, we must do these things, right? This is
actually, I just thought of another one, the Yule log.
The Yule log,
which comes from
Celtic background.
Yeah, so totally different.
Right. So there are these things like the Saturnalia festival begins and is December 17th through the 24th.
Mm-hmm.
And it was part of its practice was the swapping of gifts.
Okay.
And sort of having a great time, merrymaking.
Mm-hmm.
So they said, oh, we're gonna kind of compete. Okay. Well, our God is a real God.
Mm-hmm.
And we're going to do what you do, but for Jesus.
Okay.
In honor of Jesus, we're going to have merrymaking, and we're going to swap gifts. So now you have these two things happening side by side: the pagan world practicing Saturnalia, and now you have Christians practicing the Feast of the Nativity, and they're doing exactly the same thing, but for two different reasons.
Right. One,
Christians are being subversive.
Okay.
They are being subversive to paganism, which is a Christian thing to do. The big issue in Ephesus, in the book of Acts 16, is that because of the Christian preaching, people aren't buying the figurines, and the silversmiths are not selling any. So guess what? They're going broke, right? It's affecting their money. So the Christian behavior is subversive to paganism. Well, that's what's happening here. The additional stuff, the greenery, you talk about the tree and the lights and all that, also seems to be connected to Roman practices. What's really interesting is Rome, the shadow of Rome. Rome fell technically in 476 AD.
Okay.
And so that's the late 5th century. So its practices, even though sort of the Roman aristocracy of the first century is gone. I mean, pretty much it's gone. It's a failed state. It's just limping along, you know, and yet by the late 5th century, sort of these traditions were still there. And part of that was like how you celebrate the beginning of the month, and Roman, and there was sort of this, standard sort of appreciation of life, and especially the new year, you know, so greenery and lights. And so the beginning of the Roman year, you ushered it in with greenery and lights.
Right.
So now we have greenery and lights. Now we have this competition with Saturnalia, gifts and merrymaking, and then you have this kind of feasting. You have this sort of the Celtic Yule kind of feasting and all that together. That Yule time experience. We still use like Yule time as a saying in Christmas, but it's not a Christian expression as far as I can tell. And so it's really interesting. So these traditions are all like scattered, right? And some of it may be organically connected, but it slowly kind of turns into this developed tradition from these other traditions. But it's not because Christians were slipping into paganism.
It was taking.
Yes, it's like we're going to take what we do culturally and we're going to make it Christian. And it's this whole idea, again, taking every thought captive for the glory of Christ.
So do you think they're going to start doing that with Life Day?
Life Day. Yes.
If you know, you know.
If you do know, bless your heart for going through that. The Christmas special, right? The Star Wars. Yeah. And so here you have all these things coming together. So Christmas then becomes this time of merrymaking, family time together, or church. I mean, Christians were doing this, and they were glorifying that Jesus came in the flesh, and they were doing that initially to subvert pagan Saturnalia. And as a result, it becomes this fixed thing in the in the Christian calendar. By the 4th century, it is a significant part of the Christian calendar. Let me say something about the Christian calendar, because this is sometimes it used to throw me off a lot. Early Christianity modeled itself in different times after Judaism, that had a calendar of feasts and festivals.
Okay.
So, you had the 3 main ones, and then you had the additional ones that come from, Hanukkah, and the Feast of Purim from Esther, Hanukkah from the interbiblical period, or the early Jewish period of the Maccabees, and then you have the tabernacle, ingathering, and just a number of these other things that pass over. And so the Jewish tradition was put on a calendar. Well, Christians, in a culture that is largely illiterate, how do you keep the ideas alive except by calendrical reminders? So there is some of that. It's not unimportant. It's just one tool to remind you of your faith, right? And so Christianity embraces what we call Christmas in the 4th century, and it's stuck forever, basically. Now, all of that to say, where do we go from here, right? The question of now here I am in it's 2024, about to be 2025, and Christianity is a world religion. It has these feasts and festivals associated with it. Some groups like Churches of Christ, for example, who have had a very strong approach to nothing extra biblical, right? Nothing extra biblical.
Don't add to,
don't take away. Deuteronomy. Was it 4:2? And I'm all in on that.
Mm-hmm.
The question then becomes, is Christmas something you can practice? And if you do, what does that look like? In what sense can it be practiced?
Okay.
I think that's a fair question.
I think that is.
Especially because when you have things like Santa Claus, how do you handle Santa Claus, right?
Mm-hmm.
And the question of, are we lying? Are we being deceptive? If you're listening to this and you don't know the spoiler alert on Santa, sorry. But that's why I brought up he's a real historical person.
Mm-hmm.
The thing about Santa, and let me just take this real quick. The thing about Santa is St. Nicholas, according to some of the good sources or traditions and people who do research in this area, they talk about him as a historical figure who, for whatever reason, whether he was wealthy, whether he had converted, he was kind of a bad guy who became a Christian. However, the origin story of Nicholas of Nicholas of Myra is ultimately he leaves behind a legacy in which he cares for children, where he cares for poor, he cares for the needy. And later traditions like nuns and stuff, women have taken holy orders of celibacy, begin to imitate him. They kind of take up his banner and begin to associate what he did to this period of gift giving.
Okay.
So it's not that Saint Nicholas was like, "Hey, it's Christmas. Let me," and maybe he did, but it's what happens after him.
Mm-hmm.
And so because he was so influential in caring for people who are needy, that tradition arises.
Okay.
And becomes a kind of figure piece to it. So that's why, Santa Claus, Saint Nicholas, that's just all abbreviated for Saint Nick, right? They, many cultures have different figures that do something similar. But with Santa, that it takes on a mythic role all its own.
Yeah.
And the thing is, there's nothing wrong with imagination. Like when I go to Disneyland, for example, I allow myself to accept the illusion.
Right.
Like this is a place where special things happen, right?
A magical
place, right? And yet I know, and we introduce our children to these individuals dressed up in costumes, and we let them enjoy the moment.
Right.
We don't tell them, "Hey, the guy in the Spider-Man suit is not Spider-Man." Right? We don't do that.
Right.
Right? Because we're trying to enjoy the moment. But I've made it a very strong decision that I would emphasize that Saint Nicholas or Santa Claus is a real historical figure, and that we enjoy the myth,
right,
of the period of this time of the season. That there is something good in the world of someone who is giving, is selfless, and in no way does he should distract from Jesus. If anything, he can be a way to illustrate selflessness, right? The problem with what we've done with Christmas in general is that we've made Santa the savior of our joy.
The focus, yeah.
Okay, so we have done that. and we should repent of that. I think that's a massive problem about the sort of period. But in general, we need good mythic heroes.
Mhm.
And why should our mythic heroes simply be Superman, Batman, Wonder Woman, these kind of
Right.
these heroes, when church history is full of heroes, the nuns that took care of people who were hungry or needing something, clothing, Saint Nick who did these things, or other people inspired by the legend or the actual situation, whatever it is. We need to sort of re-own it, subvert,
Yep.
be a Christian and subvert the mythology with Christianity.
Yeah.
Now let's get back to the real, I guess, meat of our conversation. In what way should we or should we not practice Christmas? I think we need to be mindful that it's not a religious or a scriptural holiday. It's just not. And as such, we have no authority to practice it as such, at least as a church, at least as we claiming that this is the period of Jesus's birth. We have no evidence. Christians from the beginning and did not know when it happened. And we just need to leave it at that. There's an interesting passage in Romans 14, and it tells us something about periods of or discussions of disagreement. And one of the areas, now, one of the issues we have to always remember is that in Romans 14, the things that are being disagreed on are all scriptural. So in Romans 14, there is this sort of conversation that Paul just sort of jumps into regarding people who don't have the conscience to eat meat, and others who feel that they have the right to eat meat. So vegetarians versus meat eaters, right? So brisket or Barkley,
Yeah.
But Paul says that we shouldn't hurt our brother when we have the freedom to do something and we do it in front of them. We should be mindful that sometimes our liberties can hurt the people who are struggling with their conscience. And so Paul says, very important things, but at the same time, which is really interesting because there are times, like in 1 Corinthians, when Paul says, if I will make my brother stumble by eating this meat that was sacrificed to an idol, I will never eat meat ever.
Right.
He just abandoned meat altogether. There's a question if that's rhetorical exaggeration or not. But still, the point is we have to be mindful of how our choices affect others. But here in Romans 14, Paul does something a little different. He says, who are you to judge the servant of another? And in other words, he inserts the conversation that we need to be very careful in matters of opinion, that we feel we can judge the status of a person and how they stand before God in areas of opinion.
Okay.
That's Paul's shift there, right? In 1 Corinthians, he's dealing with, I'm the one eating meat, and if what I'm doing is offending someone, I would rather never eat it again, right? But here he's talking about, well, how do we have these Jews and these Gentiles in the church at Rome settle the issue of their dietary distinctions? Paul says, if you don't have the faith to eat meat, don't eat meat.
Right.
If you have the faith to eat meat, that's fine. We should not judge each other over this. The future status of where we're going because of what we're eating. But then Paul then adds things like, so whether it's what I eat or if I regard a certain day as to the Lord.
Mm-hmm.
So this is not talking about Sunday. Most likely this is dealing with just if I have a different, if I want to do something, he's probably being theoretical. I don't think the Romans are actually practicing something. But the theoretical point though is, if I choose to regard a certain day and dedicate it to the Lord, and you're like, well, what right do you have to do that? I'm not asking you to participate with me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm doing it myself. We need to be very careful, that we are using these just differences of opinion. Shall I celebrate the coming of Jesus or not as for me, a religious thing, or do I take the sectarian, the sort of treat Christmas as just a cultural event, right?
Mm-hmm.
Well, we have the faith and the scale to do that without having to call each other different things.
Right.
And I think we need to be mindful of that. Especially because when we sometimes speak against Christmas because we're like, it's not biblical, it's extra biblical, there's no authority for it, you shouldn't be practicing it. And then it becomes this odd thing where the culture is thinking of Jesus and we're saying, shame on you.
Mm-hmm.
How dare you? He wasn't born this month. We don't know when he was born. I think at that point, we need to be very careful because we may be thinking a bit too hard on this, in the sense of people do have the liberty, if they want to dedicate a day to the Lord and they're not asking you to participate, you don't have to.
Right.
But you don't have to be so compelled to tell them it's not biblical. They probably know that. They probably know there's no Christmas in the Bible.
Mm-hmm.
But you're not going to tell them there's no nativity in the Bible.
Right.
Right. And so there is a sort of weird space that we get into. Before I finish up with everything I'm going to say here, because, I told you I had an outline for today.
Yeah.
One of the things that we need to be mindful of is being careful about if something originates from outside of the Bible, that it's necessarily wrong. So the Feast of Purim, for example, comes from the book of Esther. And the Jews celebrated it.
Mm-hmm.
Jesus clearly celebrated another feast called Hanukkah, which the Feast of Lights. And that has to go back to a festival that originated during the Second Temple period, in which it was believed that this candle stayed lit when it should have turned out, and it represented the victory of Israel against all odds. And so we have to be really careful that when there are things, for example, when God says, I have these 3 festivals for you to do, that we read the Feast of Purim being observed, that Esther and Mordecai put into practice. And then we have Hanukkah, that is an truly extra biblical festival,
mm-hmm.
this Feast of Lights, and yet it is just a fact that Jesus appeals to it when he goes, I'm the light of the world.
Okay.
Right? The Gospel of John, he appeals to, I'm the light of the world. When does he do that? It's during the Feast of Lights.
Mm-hmm.
And so the issue is things can be extra biblical without us saying we've created a new way of being saved.
Right.
That things can be extra biblical without us saying we are creating new worship services to celebrate something extra biblical. We can say, our culture and society is thinking about this. We didn't create the calendar. We kind of
adopted it.
We've adopted it. We are beneficiaries, or we have inherited it.
Mm-hmm.
And our society has as well. So what's the best use of our time? And what's the best use of being Christian? Do we subvert the Christian's subversion of paganism? Or do we subvert its secularization of this event, where we're talking about bunnies and eggs instead of Jesus' resurrection, or we're talking about a fat guy in a red suit and reindeer? That is the real question. Do we subvert that?
Right.
And I think that's where I think I don't want to stop here.
But going back to what you were saying, as far as, who are you to judge?
Yeah.
Now, if it was something that was totally sinful,
that's a totally different, yes.
Then we need to step in and say, hey, this is wrong.
And and that's right. And that's where some people will get in here. Well, creating a festival is sinful. And I guarantee you, someone when I just said that goes, that's right, amen. When we created a festival that's on the Bible, it's sinful. Okay. Well, as a culture, we've created Thanksgiving,
right?
And when Abraham Lincoln inaugurated it in the United States, it was a festival to honor God for all the gifts he gives us, from which we should be grateful and thankful.
Mm-hmm.
So when we sit together at home during Thanksgiving and we step into this dedication, the purpose that is extra biblical,
right?
Are we not also guilty as Christians having a festival dedicated to God's gifts? Because now that's an extra biblical event. I know of no one, I mean, very few. I don't know them personally, but I'm sure there are some who will just abstain from Thanksgiving because it's a feast dedicated to God's gifts. Well, why not? Can a family get together, practice generosity, and have a feast together when there's a time in which people are celebrating that the Savior came into the world?
Mm-hmm.
That I'm not advocating, and people need to pay attention here. I'm not advocating that we do that at church. I'm not advocating that we do it in services, but I am suggesting that we need to be more careful about how we treat each other on this particular issue, because at the end of the day, Jesus did come. Mm-hmm. He was born of a virgin. It was celebrated by angels, and it should be celebrated by every Christian in their faith and in their heart. And it does not take away from the actual work of Jesus that he did when he died on the cross, was raised from the dead, ascended into heaven, and is currently reigning. And we just need to be, I think we just need to be careful.
Right.
Now, that's my main takeaway from this conversation is careful on how we judge people.
Mm-hmm.
Over things that are biblical, yet they're not scriptural.
Right.
And be careful that we don't end up looking more secular than the skeptic.
Because we don't know what's in people's hearts.
Right. True that. So, all right.
So,
yeah, what's your take? What do you think?
I've learned. You didn't say anything about Krampus, though.
Yes.
Which, no. Anyway, we hope you've enjoyed this holiday Christmas episode of Monkey Bread Theology. We would invite you, if you have a question about theology, swing by our website, and there's a spot there where you can ask a question. Catch up with us on Facebook.
Yeah, and I just want to say out there for anyone who, has further question. The reason why we're putting this out now is, if you want to talk a little bit more about this topic, send us a follow-up question. You can, if you know me, send me a Facebook message or send Tim something.
Definitely.
And definitely want to have this conversation. I think it's an important one.
Yeah.
So I took some time this episode to really try to flesh out some details about what I think is a major issue. But check out our website.
Yep.
We look forward to hearing more from you.
Okay.
And I want to thank everyone who has been subscribing.
Yep.
I want to thank everyone who has been joining us and reaching out to us, letting us know how much our talks have been helpful or encouraging. And so thank you for blessing us with your encouragement. And we hope to continue what we're doing.
Yes. And also a thank you to Ministry League.
That's right.
So if you have the Ministry League app, that's one more place that you can find Monkey Bread Theology. And again, thanks for being with us on this episode, and we hope you come back for more.